The rain had been falling for 3 days when Ellen Vassar came down out of the northern passes, carrying a leather satchel worn pale at the corners, and a single wooden case no wider than her 2 hands laid flat. The case held her mother's needles, a set of 12, each one ground and polished across 40 years of a seamstress's labor, and a pair of shears whose blades had been sharpened so many times they had grown thin as willow leaves. That case was the whole of what remained to her, and she gripped it against her chest the way another woman might have held a child. Her boots had let the water in somewhere below the second village, and she had eaten the last of her bread the previous morning. She was 31 years old, and she had buried a husband, a trade, and a house in the space of 11 months. And she had come to the far edge of the province because there was nowhere nearer that did not know her face. The town was called Harrogate, and it sat in a fold of the moors where wool came down from the high sheep runs to be spun and woven and finished. Above the town, on a rise, where the wind never rested, stood a house of gray stone, with a long timbered workshop attached to its flank. She had heard 3 towns back that the man who kept that house had once run the finest finishing shop in the district, and had let it fall to ruin after his wife died. She did not go there for charity. She had learned already what charity cost. She went there because a ruined workshop was still a workshop, and because a man who had let his trade rot might be a man who no longer looked too closely at where his help had come from. She knocked at the workshop door rather than the house door, because that was where the light burned, a single lamp, yellow against the blue, dark. When the door opened, she found herself looking up at a broad man in his middle 40s, with gray coming into a dark beard and eyes the flat, steady color of the stone the house was built from. He said nothing. He looked at her and at the water running off the brim of her hat and at the wooden case held to her front, and he waited. The waiting was not unkind. It was the waiting of a man who had learned that words spent too soon were words wasted. "I'm told you finish garments here," she said. "Or that you did," he said. "Once I can finish anything a needle will mend. I don't want a bed given me. I want work, and I'll take it at whatever a hand is paid, and I'll show you what I'm worth before you owe me a coin." He looked past her at the rain, then stepped back. "There's no work here worth paying for," he said, "but there's a coat." He took down a heavy wool coat from a hook on the wall and laid it across a cutting table under the lamp. It had been a fine coat once. The right shoulder seam had torn clean through and been pinned with a straight pin. The lining hung loose along one side, and a horn button was gone from the front. "Can you mend this coat?" He said it flatly, as a test, and nothing more. And he did not know he was asking the question that would divide his whole life into a before and an after. Ellen set her case on the table and opened it. She did not answer with her mouth. She answered with her hands. She had the shoulder seam turned and closed with a saddle stitch before he had finished building up the fire, and she matched the missing horn button from a jar on the shelf so near the original, and she caught up the fallen lining with stitches so small and even they vanished into the cloth. When she was done, she shook the coat out sharp and held it to the lamp so the light could not find a single fault. She laid it back on the table. The man came and looked. He ran a thumb along the shoulder seam and could not feel where the tear had been. He was quiet a long moment. "My name is Corin Yeld," he said. "The room off the kitchen has a bed in it. Cold. There's a stove you can light. 2 shillings a week and you're board. Same as I paid a finisher, when I paid finishers. You'll have work in the morning." He nodded once as though the name were a fact to be filed, and took the lamp to light her across the yard. He did not ask where she had come from, or what she was fleeing, or why a woman who could stitch like that was walking the moor roads in the rain, with everything she owned in a wooden box. Corin Yeld was a slow man to speak. She would come to learn. Slow and quiet, and given to long silences that other people mistook for coldness. But he was steady as the stone he lived in, and in the days that followed, she would understand that the two things were not opposites, but the same thing seen from different sides. That first night she lay in the cold little room and pressed her mother's shears to her breastbone under the blanket, and for the first time in 11 months she did not weep before she slept. In the morning she found there was a child. The girl was perhaps 7, with her father's flat gray eyes and a stillness far past her years. Her name was Marrow, which Ellen thought a strange hard name for so small a thing, until she learned the mother had chosen it. And after that, she did not think it strange, only sad. The child had gone silent the winter her mother died, and had not found her voice since, and Corin had stopped expecting it, and the whole gray house had arranged itself around that silence, the way a river arranges itself around a stone. The workshop, walked in full daylight, told her everything about the man who owned it. It had been built for 8 hands to work at once. Now 3 old men shuffled through it, doing the least that would keep their wages, oiling looms that had not turned in a year, sweeping a floor that only they walked. Bolts of good wool were going gray with dust on the high shelves. Along one wall hung finished garments that had never been collected, coats and cloaks and fine wool suits whose order tickets had gone yellow. It was a business that had not died so much as fallen asleep and been left to lie. Ellen stood in the middle of it and felt the old hunger waken her, the hunger to set a thing to rights, and she began that very hour to sweep and sort and take stock. It was on the 4th day that Corin Yeld did the thing that undid her. She had been eating alone in the kitchen, taking her bread and broth standing at the counter as the help ate. On the 4th evening, Corin came in and found her there, and he looked at the long, empty table where he and the silent child took their supper, and something moved behind his flat gray eyes. He did not make a speech of it. He took a 3rd bowl down from the shelf and set it at the table beside his own, laid a spoon beside it, pulled the chair out a hand's width, and sat down and waited. Then she carried it to the table and sat, and the child watched with wide gray eyes, and no one said a word. The plain kindness of that empty chair pulled out for her nearly broke her, where months of hardship had not. She had been invisible so long she had forgotten she could be seen. She began to notice things after that. She noticed Corin mended the workshop stove himself rather than call the smith, and read at night by a single candle to save the oil, and that the good coat she had mended that first night was the only good coat he owned. She noticed he came back from his monthly journeys to town, quieter and grayer than he had gone. She noticed the 3 old men were paid on the 1st of every month without fail, even in a shop that earned nothing, and she began to wonder how a man who earned nothing kept 3 wages and a 4th, and where the money came from, and how long it could last. She found the answer near the end of her third week, staying late to sort the wall of abandoned garments, when she found in the back office a drawer that would not close for the papers crammed inside it. She gathered them to set them straight, and in gathering them she read, and what she read stopped her breath. There was a loan. Taken 4 years past before the wife died to buy the great looms and the high shelves of wool, back when the shop was the finest in the district. It had been taken from a lending house in the city, the Meridian Trust, at terms a prosperous shop could carry and a sleeping one could not. The principal was £600. Karen had been paying only the interest for 2 years, £4 a month, and the principal had never moved. And now there was a letter, dated a month gone, that Ellen read 3 times before she understood it. The Meridian Trust had been bought. A man named Sefton Crail had acquired the debt along with 100 others, and Sefton Crail did not want £4 a month for 20 years. He wanted the land. The house and workshop stood on 11 acres at the edge of a town. The new rail spur would reach within 2 years, and land near a rail spur was worth 10 times land far from one. The letter, beneath its courtesies, was a knife. The full £600 would be called due on the first day of spring, 91 days from the date Ellen held it. And if not paid in full, the property would pass to the trust in settlement. He could barely pay for. He had said nothing to anyone, and had gone on lighting the stove and pulling out her chair, carrying the whole weight of it alone, because he was a slow man, and a proud one, and had decided she understood, to simply let it come. She stood in the little office, with the lamp guttering, and did a thing she could not fully explain to herself afterward, except that a life which had taken everything had left her one thing no one had thought to take. It had left her the ability to look at a ruined thing and see, precisely and without sentiment, what it would take to mend it. She sat down at the account desk and did not go to bed until the sky went gray. And by morning she had a plan. She said nothing to Corin of the letter. She only asked him at breakfast whether she might have the run of the workshop and leave to sell the finished garments on the wall. He looked at her over his bread. "The custom's gone," he said. "The custom's gone," she agreed. "The coats are not. A finished coat is money hung on a nail." Something in her face told him she was not asking idly, and after a moment he nodded the way he did, and pushed the whole of it across to her without another word, and in that nod he handed her a thing he had handed no one since his wife died, which was trust. She began with the wall. There were 41 finished garments hanging there, and where fashion had turned, she recut a lapel, or shortened a hem, or changed a button. Small work spread across a week, and she turned 4 years of dead stock, and she turned 4 years of dead stock, and she turned 4 years of dead stock, and she turned 4 years of dead stock into 41 garments. Then she did the thing no one in that sleeping shop had thought to do. She wrote letters. She had a fine, clear hand, and she wrote to every name in the old order book, telling each that their garment was finished and finer than ordered, and might be had for the price agreed if collected by a given date, and telling those whose garments had been recut that Yeld's shop was working again and taking custom. She spent 3 of her own shillings on the post, and did not tell Corin that either. They came slowly at first, one, and then two. Driving up the rise to a shop the town had thought dead, and each one who came found work finished so beautifully. By the end of the first month, the wall was half empty, and there were new orders pinned where the old dead ones had been, and the three old men were oiling looms that turned again, and one of them, the eldest, wept a little to see it and pretended it was the dust. Through all of this, the child watched. Marrow followed Ellen through the workshop like a small, silent shadow, and Ellen talked to her as she worked, naming the stitches and the cloths and the tools, and one afternoon the child leaned back against her, and Ellen felt the small, warm weight of her and had to look hard at the seam to keep her eyes clear. The child did not speak, but she began to smile, small and quick, and she took to sleeping in the warm workshop, curled in a nest of wool ends, and Corin, coming in of an evening to find his daughter asleep at the seamstress's feet, would stand in the doorway with a look on his flat gray face that he did not know Ellen could see. For she saw him now as he had once seen her. She saw that when they sat late at the account desk, she working the figures and he mending a loom shuttle nearby, she saw that he had begun to talk in his slow, careful way of the wife who had died, and the shop as it had been, things he had told no one, and she found that she did not mind waiting for him to be sure of the ground before he set his foot. She had thought that part of herself had been buried with her husband. It had only been sleeping, like the shop, and needed work and warmth, and a chair pulled out to wake. But the figures would not reach 600 pounds by spring. The garments and new custom had brought in near 200, and 200 was not 600, and the days were falling away. Then going once more through the drawer that would not close, she found what she had missed the first night, and it changed everything. Among the abandoned orders were 9 that had been paid in full in advance. 4 years past, 9 customers had paid the full price of their garments up front. Those garments had been made and hung and never collected, and the money had long since been spent on looms. But the point of law was this, and Ellen knew it because her own dead husband had been ruined by not knowing it. Goods paid for and finished but uncollected for more than 3 years reverted in ownership to the maker, with the paid sums forfeit to him. The 9 garments were Corin's to sell again, clear and unencumbered, 140 pounds already in the house. And buried deeper in the same drawer was a receipt she had nearly discarded, a receipt for a consignment of 40 bolts of superfine wool, paid in full 4 years past, never delivered, because the merchant had failed that same year. The debt had passed to the merchant's estate. 40 bolts of superfine at current prices came to near 380 pounds, owed and never claimed, because a grieving man had lost the receipt in a drawer. Ellen sat very still in the little office. Then she wrote 2 more letters. Sefton Crail came up the rise on the last day of winter, one day before the debt fell due, in a fine covered gig. He was a smooth, soft-handed man of 50 in a coat that cost more than the old men earned in a year, and he had come to survey the property he was certain to take. He was surprised to find the workshop lit and a woman at the account desk. He was not surprised for long. "You'll be the housekeeper," he said, not looking at her, drawing off his gloves. "Fetch Mr. Yeld. Tell him Crail of the Meridian is here to settle." "Mr. Yeld is at the looms," Ellen said. You may settle with me. I keep his accounts." Crail smiled the smile of a man humoring a child. "Sweetheart," he said, "this is business between men and lending houses. £600 due tomorrow, in full, or the property passes to the trust. There's nothing for a housekeeper to keep after that. Now fetch him." Elin did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a raised voice is the sound a person makes when they have run out of facts. She opened the clean book. £600 principal, she said. "Correct. Against it, this shop holds the following: 9 garments made and paid, 4 years past, uncollected past, the 3-year term which by the statute of uncollected goods revert wholly to the maker with the paid sums forfeit to him. Further, a consignment of 40 bolts of superfine wool, paid in full and never delivered by a merchant now failed, the debt of which passed to his estate, which is agreed in writing this week to settle at current value, being £380. She turned the letter toward him. Further, £240 taken in the past 90 days in collected orders and new custom. Entered here, verified against the bank in Harrogate, whose note of deposit you may also read. £760 standing against a debt of £600. Mr. Crail? Mr. Yeld will pay you in full tomorrow, as your letter demands, and keep his land and his shop. And there is nothing, I think, for a housekeeper to fetch." The smile left Sefton Crail's face. He read the letters. He read the bank note. He read them again. The way a man reads a seam he is certain is weak and cannot find the fault in, because there was no fault, because Ellen Vassar mended things so that no one could find where they had been broken. He said something about reviewing the figures and got back into his gig and drove down the rise. And he did not come back. He had dismissed the one person in that gray house. It would have cost him nothing to look at, and it had cost him 11 acres and a rail spur, and that is the whole account of Sefton Crail. They told Corin that evening. Elin laid the clean book before him at the supper table, and walked him through it. The 9 garments, the 40 bolts, the £240, the debt paid, and the land held. She watched his flat gray eyes move down the columns, and understood he was not reading numbers, but reading her, reading 3 months of quiet work, done without his knowing, a whole war fought and won at his own account desk. He was silent a long time. Then he set his broad hand flat on the book. "You did all this," he said, "and never said." It was not a question. She only nodded. And Curran Yeld sat in his own kitchen and understood, with the slow certainty of a man who must be sure of the ground before he sets his foot, that he loved her plainly and entirely, the way he loved the moor and the turning looms and the stone beneath his house, as a fact to the world that had somehow always been true and only now been noticed. It was Marrow who broke first. On a morning near the true beginning of spring, with the first green coming to the moor, Ellen was kneeling to pin the hem of a small blue coat she had made from the scrap wool, the child's very own first fine coat, when Marrow looked down at her and said in a small rusty voice that had not been used in 2 years, "Will you stay?" Not a question. Ellen's hands went still. She could not answer for the fullness in her throat. Corin, who had come to the door and heard his daughter speak for the first time since her mother died, stood gripping the frame with both hands. He came to Ellen that evening on the workshop step, in the long gold light of the first warm dusk of the year, with the moor greening below them and new grass on the wind, and he held the mended coat over his arm, the one she had fixed that first night in the rain. "I'm a slow man," he said. "You'll have marked that." "I've marked it," Ellen said. "Slow to speak, slower to see. My wife's 2 years gone, and I let the shop die with her, and I'd have let this house go too. And it took a stranger in the rain to mend a coat and then mend a hole of it, while I sat by." He turned the coat in his hands. "I'm no good with the words for it, but I'd have you stay. Not as a hand and not for wages. As my wife, if you'll have a slow man that let you save his life before he'd the sense to see it. As Marrow's mother, for you're that already, and she's told me so plainer than I could. What there is, I'd have it be yours and mine both, and no line drawn between." Ellen looked at him in the gold light, and there was warmth in her dry, small smile. "I was wondering when you'd get there," she said. "You took the whole winter over it," Corin yelled. Then, because a plain man had spoken plainly and deserved the same, she took the mended coat from his arms and set it aside and took his rough hands in her two capable ones. "I'll stay. I'd have stayed the night you pulled the chair out. Some things a person sees the mend of at once. You are only slow to reach it." They were married in the little gray church at the foot of the rise, on a bright day at the height of spring, with the 3 old men in their best coats, and half the town come up to see the shop that had risen from the dead. Ellen wore a dress of soft gray wool. She had cut and stitched herself in the small hours, plain and perfect, and she carried a handful of wild yellow gorse from the moor road, and Marrow walked before her in the blue coat. The truest vows between them had been spoken already, long before, in a chair pulled out and a coat mended and a war fought in silence, so the words in the church were only the naming of a thing long since made. 5 years on, if you had driven up the rise on a gold evening in the height of summer, you would have found 8 hands at work at the looms, and 8 more in the finishing room, and orders coming from the city itself, now that the rail spur ran below the town, and a new wing built on the gray house of the same stone. You would have found Marrow 12 now, and never again silent, teaching a saddle stitch to a small brother of 6 and a smaller sister of 4 in the warm workshop where she had once slept in a nest of wool ends. You would have found Caron grayer and no faster with his words, but quick enough to reach for his wife's hand across a table. And you would have found Ellen at the account desk with a clean book open before her, and hung on the wall above it, in a case of glass, an old wooden box no wider than 2 hands, holding 12 worn needles and a pair of shears ground thin as willow leaves. The whole of what she had carried down out of the passes in the rain, the whole of what she had needed. Sefton Crail had gone bankrupt in the city 2 winters back, having overreached on a debt he could not carry, and Ellen, hearing of it, felt neither triumph nor pity, only the quiet certainty of a woman who has learned that those who mistake silence for weakness are undone by it every time. For love, she had come to understand, is not the loud thing the songs make of it. It is the patient thing. It is a chair pulled out, a coat mended, a war fought quietly on another's behalf, and never spoken of until the war's won. It is being seen at last after a life of walking unseen and choosing, once seen, to stay. It is not given. It is made, stitch by small even stitch, until no one alive can find the place where the broken thing was joined, and the mend is stronger than the whole cloth ever was.